Now that we've talked about all of the different categories of psychotherapies, or at least the broad categories that we've chosen to focus on for this class, we're going to move on and start talking about cultural and gender issues that relate to psychotherapy. Because if there's one thing that we have learned throughout this course is that there are always going to be differences based on culture or gender or societal structure of some kind. So let's delve into that here. Now, one of the biggest factors to keep in mind when we're thinking about culture and cultural factors specifically that are influencing which kinds of treatment we use, we should keep in mind that there's almost always going to be a North American or Western European bias. So most of what we've been taught has been very North American focused, mostly because we're in North America. So we're only exposed to things that are familiar to us. So we see a lot of these biases where we focus on individualistic cultures or individualistic treatments because that's what we're in, an individualistic culture. So we lose out on exposure to different perspectives, different ideas, and different treatments that come from more collectivistic cultures, that come from countries literally anywhere else in the world except for North America and Western Europe. So keep in mind that a lot of what we're learning, a lot of what we've talked about is inherently biased just by the nature of who's teaching it and where it's being taught. But if we want to get into some details here, so we have a lot of assumptions that come from this thought process of North American and Western European culture. So the idea here being that our problems usually are thought to originate within the individual. So if I'm having behavioral problems, it's because of something internal to me. I have a problem and it's being shown in my behavior. There's also the thought that these problems usually come from dysfunctional thinking, conflict, or stress responses. So that problematic behavior is because I'm thinking wrong. I have conflict. I have a stress response. So again, focusing on the individual as an individualistic culture. There's also this assumption that people are capable of expressing their feelings. If you have a feeling or an emotion, the assumption is you can talk about it. And again, the idea that people should take personal responsibility for their own improvement. If I want to be a better person, I have to try and make that happen. Now, of course, all of these very individual-focused perspectives and ideas are absolutely not shared by all cultures. So if you think of a collectivistic culture, instead of it being an individual's problem, maybe it's a community's problem. Maybe the community should take responsibility for improvement. And sort of different ways of framing those thoughts. And because of those different perspectives, we end up with different treatments or different ways of using treatments. So again, as an individualistic culture, we wouldn't think anything against going to a therapist to talk about problems with our parents. Maybe I need help learning to talk to my mother, so I would go see a therapist. But in a collectivistic culture, voicing the idea of having a conflict or a problem with your own parents might be unheard of. Or in an individualistic culture, going to see a therapist to improve your self-esteem, to become a more competitive and self-sufficient person would again be very, very out of place in a culture that supports the community and working as a whole. So again, keep in mind our own biases and how different ways of thinking can change the treatments that we'd use and how we'd use them. Other things to really keep in mind in terms of culture are cultural norms. What is acceptable to do or to see a therapist about, or different behaviors that may be appropriate or inappropriate depending on the area. Those things are all regulated by cultural norms. So a behavior that is perfectly normal in North America might be considered a maladaptive behavior in some other country. So the cultural norms are really going to affect what we seek, or what we seek treatment for, how we would go about it, whether we'd seek treatment at all those sorts of things. We should also keep in mind that people tend not to seek help outside of their own culture. So, because of all the problems we've talked about, it becomes very difficult to talk to a therapist who isn't from your culture, who doesn't understand your culture, and therefore doesn't necessarily know where you're coming from in therapy. There's also problems with language barriers. So, it's very, very difficult to get treatment from someone who doesn't speak your language. We also have issues with access to treatment. So in some places, therapy is exorbitantly expensive. In a lot of places, it's very expensive. So it becomes unaffordable. Then you get into sort of not just differences between cultures, but differences within a culture where maybe if you have a high income, you can afford to go to therapy. But if you're in a lower income bracket, maybe you can't. And that's another can of worms that I don't have time to get into. It's also hard to get treatment if you're not within a community. So if you live in a rural community, it's very hard to have access to a therapist unless your small community happens to have a therapist. And we also run into an issue of sometimes there's a lack of culturally responsive treatments. So sometimes you're from a culture that isn't well represented within therapies. And so if there isn't someone who's trained to deal with a particular culture or who isn't experienced in it, then maybe you don't have an option. You don't have someone who you can go and talk to. Now, this isn't to say that people can only go to therapists who are of the same ethnic group or from the same culture or anything like that. But what we need to have are culturally competent therapists. So, therapists who can use knowledge about the client's culture to try and achieve a broad understanding of the client. Basically, if you understand the cultural background that someone is coming from, you can better relate to them, you can better understand them, and you can better treat them. There's even research that shows that introducing different elements from a particular culture can help facilitate therapy. So, if there's a group that believes in faith healers or anything like that, if you can introduce elements of that, if you can incorporate that into the therapy, it can help with outcomes. And so, a culturally competent therapist has to be attentive to differences at both the individual and cultural level, while also not falling into the idea of cultural stereotypes. So it's not just, I understand this category of people. It has to be a more deep understanding than that. It has to be an idea of, I understand what's important in this particular culture, while also being open to the fact that individuals don't necessarily follow the cultural standard to a T. So for example, I am Canadian, but my beliefs aren't necessarily the same as the quote unquote average Canadian. So a good therapist is going to understand that there are cultural elements, there are cultural aspects that are important, but there are also variations based on the individual. So different individuals will value different parts of their culture differently. So a long roundabout way of saying that to be a good therapist, you have to sort of think on your feet, be open-minded, and to take a lot of different things into account when you're treating individuals. And of course, we can talk about differences between the genders. And I'll give my standard disclaimer that the textbook sticks to the old binary of male versus female, but there is more research ongoing as we look at the whole spectrum of genders, whether people are feeling more on the female end of the scale or male end of the scale or somewhere in the middle. It gets a lot more complicated than what we can get into in a first-year psychology course. But the disclaimer out of the way, of course, there are going to be lots of differences between males and females in terms of treatment and therapy and how they respond to therapy. Because as we've gone through all of this course, we've talked about different gender differences where there's differences in which disorders we're more prone to, or in how we experience the world or how we interact with the world. And so if we focus on for females, a lot of therapy is going to focus on the changing women's life circumstances. And so there's a couple of layers here we can pick apart. So over the course of their lives, individual women will sort of change roles. So some choose to go down the path of motherhood. So they might go from being independent business people. They may choose to go and have a family. They may be a caregiver. They may continue to be a breadwinner. They may continue to work while raising children, or they might not choose to raise children at all. But overall, women tend to evolve and change over time as their role in the family evolves and changes over time, which can, of course, affect what they need from therapy and how they are treated in therapy. But there's also sort of the larger scale of changing women's life circumstances in that over time, we've gone from, say, the idea in the 50s and 60s of the ideal housewife to more modern times when we look at less structured gender roles. So changes in society's perception and women's own perceptions of their own role is also going to have a massive influence on what they seek out therapy for and what therapy can do for them. So again, really, really complicated ideas that we could spend an entire course talking about. Now, for many therapists, when treating women, there is an awareness of the oppressive environmental conditions, the idea of women feeling like they have to fit a particular gender role or feeling like they should be a certain thing. And it isn't necessarily the best course of action for the therapist to encourage them to try and change the environment. It's very difficult for one individual to try and change all of society's perception of that gender. So instead, they might choose to focus on changing how that individual internalizes or thinks about or interprets those oppressive conditions. How do they choose to act in that environment? And so a therapist's role would then be to focus on supporting the individual's decision, the choices that they make to try and meet their needs. So what's the best way that they can get them functioning in a particular environment? It's not necessarily ideal, but it seems to be the way that things go. And interestingly, gender sensitivity, or being aware of the challenges that are faced by either women or men, depending on who you're treating, is a lot more important than the gender of the therapist themselves. So it doesn't matter if you're being treated by a man or a woman. It's more their sensitivity and adjusting their method of therapy to whatever you are. So it's their ability to cater to what you need rather than their specific gender that makes it more beneficial, which is an interesting thing to look at.